Welcome to the Alenki Yacht Podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Dorothy Wickenden. Dorothy has been an executive director for the New Yorker since 1996, and she's also a moderator for the weekly podcast, The Political Scene. Today, we will speak about her latest book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. Dorothy, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Alan.
So I love talking about female leadership, and well, your book is in a way about that three friends who, against the circumstances of the time period and how much their voice was not even considered important, they created a great movement and they influenced also the history of the state. So I'm eager to dig into it, but first of all, I would like to know a little bit about you. You have been working for the New Yorkers, what, almost 25 years or more. And how did that get started? Did you always wanted to work on a magazine or editing? What's the story behind your work?
Yes, well, I guess it goes actually way back to my father, who was first a fiction writer and then became a fiction editor at Harcourt Brace Jovanovich in New York. And I just kind of fell into it naturally. So I started out at a little tiny quarterly magazine named Shakespeare Quarterly, and then moved on to the New Republic magazine, which is a very feisty, small political magazine based in Washington. And I was there for a long time, 15 years, and kind of moved up to become executive editor there, and then was drawn away to Newsweek magazine when it was still a very important voice in American journalism. And I was a senior editor there. And then I was, after about a year and a half, I was lured away by Tina Brown, who was then the editor of The New Yorker, and I have been there ever since.
Okay, and you wrote, and when is it that you decided to become a writer? Because you have been working as an editor, looking at other people's writing, but then at a given moment, you said, this is my turn now.
Yeah, well, and this is actually sort of a funny story. I had written on and off over the years, including way back when I was at the New Republic, but my primary job was editorial, and that's very demanding, so I didn't get to write all that often. And then I can't even remember what year it was. It was so long ago. I broke my ankle, and I was laid up for a couple of weeks at home. And I just started going through my desk drawers, and at the back of one drawer, I found a folder of letters that my mother had copied for me, and there were letters from my grandmother, who grew up in Auburn, New York. She had gone to the western slope of Colorado in the early 20th century to teach school in a one-room schoolhouse on the top of a remote mountain to the children of homesteaders. And the letters home were so vivid and funny and fascinating about a chapter in American history that had almost been forgotten. I finished reading them and I was so excited. I went in to tell my husband, who's also a journalist who works at the New York Times, and he said, well, I think there's a book in that, or at least a magazine piece. So I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about the letters, and then I immediately got a book contract and wrote that book. And then, so in the course of researching that book, I learned a lot more about this amazing town of Auburn, New York, which too had kind of fallen on hard times, and most people in the United States know nothing about that part, or very little about that part of New York State. And that my research into that book eventually led to this most recent book.
Okay, great. So here we have three characters. Can you tell us who those characters are and what are their contribution towards our, in the United States history?
Yeah, so it's an amazing combination of characters, actually, and I discovered their relationship and their activism when I went to the Seward House Museum in Auburn, my grandmother's hometown, and got a tour of what is now a museum. And the young director took me down the narrow back staircase, original staircase of the house, into the basement, and she said, this is where. So William H. Seward was a very well-known statesman in the United States. He became Lincoln's Secretary of State during the Civil War. But I didn't know, I'd never even heard of his wife, who was, I assume, just a typical wife at the time, politician's wife. And that's basically how she's been portrayed historically. So, but that's not how the young education director of the museum described her. And she shows me this basement kitchen, and she says, this is where Frances Seward harbored fugitive slaves for the decade leading up to the Civil War. And she was outraged by most of the biographies of Seward, who had portrayed her as a kind of pathetic shut-in. She did have a neurotic, she did have a number of health problems, and she was very recessive as a person, but she turned out to be this incredible dynamo in private, who was very, very much an impassioned abolitionist and advocate for women's rights. So that, I thought, was remarkable. And then just quickly to tell you about her colleagues, around the corner was her best friend, and that was Martha Coffin Wright, who was about her age. They both had, households full of young children, and Martha was a middle-class Quaker, and she had been brought up by her mother to believe that the abolition of slavery, that activism against slavery was basically a moral duty. And she absolutely believed that. And she too believed in women's rights and was much more outspoken publicly than Frances was. So they came together in this very conservative town, and they began to kind of conspire together about, well, what can we do given all the constraints against women doing anything? And then they were introduced to Harriet Tubman, who every American and many Canadians know because of her phenomenal Underground Railroad exploits. And when Harriet Tubman liberated herself, she went to Philadelphia, and she introduced herself to all of the abolitionists there, one of whom, probably one of the most influential of whom, was Martha Coffin Wright's older sister, Lucretia Mott. And Lucretia Mott introduced Harriet Tubman to Martha, and Martha introduced Tubman to Frances. And so they became pivotal contacts for Harriet Tubman on her Underground Railroad expeditions, and lifelong friends. They were really close. And Tubman, of course, was this source of great inspiration to these two white women who had, nominally believed in everything that Harriet Tubman represented, but were a little bit hamstrung by how they could go about expressing themselves. And Harriet Tubman, in effect, gave them the courage to break out.
So at that time, harboring a slave was a crime. Was it a federal crime? And what was the penalty for hiding a slave in your basement?
Yes, they were violating the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and it was a crime. And if you were caught, you could be fined $1,000 and theoretically be sent to jail for up to a year. So it was, as the years went on, and and they got closer to the Civil War, as activism grew and grew, it was less likely that that people in the North were actually going to be imprisoned for this. But people like Frances and Martha thought that violation of this federal law was something that they had to do. This was it was their duty as Christians and as people who held these beliefs very strongly.
And of course, they are in a free slave, New York, but not everyone is sympathetic to the cause. What was the pushback that they were getting from their community? I heard in your book that they were, one of them was considered a dangerous woman.
Yeah, she was. Her name, basically, Frances Seward and Martha Coffin Wright and their husbands were the only, today we would consider them radicals or progressives, very, very strong progressives. Everyone else, literally everyone else in the town, was quite conservative. These were farmers, industrialists, bankers, and they didn't, even though slavery had been abolished in New York State, most members of that part of it was kind of Western New York State at the time, had no interest in slavery, and it was considered a problem and an institution that was relegated to the South. And they believed in perpetuating social norms. So in 1848, Martha Coffin Wright was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first convention in the United States for women's rights. And after that, she became very active in that cause. And that appalled her neighbors, except for Frances. And at Seneca Falls, she got to know the most famous person there, who was Frederick Douglass, who had only liberated himself from slavery 10 years earlier. They became friends, and he was a regular lecturer across New York State about abolition. And so Martha would invite him whenever he came through Auburn to stay at her house for a meal or to spend the night. And her neighbors were aghast by this. There was the idea of racial equality was one of the biggest taboos along with women speaking publicly and some of these other issues that these women pursued. But Martha believed that you could only change people's misguided beliefs if you practiced what you preached. And so she thought she served as an example to her, her very hidebound neighbors, that this was the way Americans should conduct themselves. She and Harriet Tubman and Frances Seward believed literally in the Declaration of Independence, which after all had been written not so very long before they were living. So this was her way of asserting herself. And she overheard a guest at a local party, a woman, say to another woman, "Who is that handsome lady?" And the other woman said, "That is Mrs. David Wright. She was a very dangerous woman." And in the terms of the time, she was.
Right. There's something that I don't understand. So Harriet Tubman, she escaped slavery. And how is it that she was able to go to New York and not being captured by the Slave Act?
She was in the early years. She escaped in 1849, and then we had the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. So you're right; it was incredibly dangerous what she was doing. But she had this phenomenal series of gifts along with her courage, and she just she had a way of disguising herself when she felt that people were close on her path. There were many, many close calls. But as she said much later in life, when she was on stage with Susan B. Anthony, one of her friends, she said, "I can say what no other conductor can say, which is that I've never lost a passenger and I have never run my train off the tracks." So she was in addition to being phenomenally courageous, she was a great leader, inspirational, and she was tough with the people whom she was taking north. She really had very strict rules about how people had to obey what she said, and when she told them that they were being followed, they had to be very careful, and she knew how to hide herself in the woods, and they only traveled by night. So it was really, really dangerous. But she and people, other abolitionist friends, told her this was suicidal every time she went down into the enslaved parts of Maryland where she had been born. She was putting herself at risk and all of her passengers. And she said, never mind. She believed that God spoke to her directly. She was deeply religious, and she said, "God tells me when danger is near, and I know how to avoid it."
Wow. I wonder how their life changed after the Civil War, where I guess the slavery was abolished.
Well, so Harriet Tubman, and then the other thing I discovered in the course of doing the research for this book, she, when the Civil War broke out, she didn't want to stay at home. She wanted to go down and fight. Well, she couldn't fight because she was a woman, but she got her through abolitionist contacts in Massachusetts, including the governor of Massachusetts, who was an abolitionist. She got herself down to Port Royal, South Carolina, which was Union occupied territory. And she did take part in a series of river raids that ended up liberating 750 people from rice plantations along the water. So she had, an incredible 3 years during the war. And then when she went back, she settled into a farmhouse that had been sold to her by Frances Seward in Auburn, which was just a mile down the street. And again, this was just, unheard of. A woman selling property to a Black woman who was considered, before the war, a fugitive slave. So then Tubman settled into that house, but she continued her work on behalf of the liberated slaves who needed a great deal of assistance as they set out to make themselves autonomous Americans. So she did fundraising and continued that work, including her work for women's rights and for the rights, full rights of Black Americans to become full citizens, until her death in 1913. Wow. So she lived a very long life. Martha continued her work, which was dangerous in the early years, lecturing about women's rights and also about Black rights until her death. And Frances had an untimely death quite a bit earlier after the war, but I'm not going to give too much of the book away. That itself is an amazing episode.
So some like Harriet Tubman and some of these characters, they have been forgotten by history, and you and other writers are kind of reviving their stories. I wonder right now what kind of recognition they are getting as we discover more about their bravery.
Well, and Harriet Tubman is an interesting figure because, of course, she's an American hero. And when I was growing up, I read about her, in my 8th grade textbook, and she got, maybe a paragraph. But in the years since, scholars have been unearthing all kinds of documents and have made a lot of headway. So I had, those sources to work from. And most recently, it was just, maybe a couple of months ago, there was a group of archaeologists discovered the cabin where Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross, had lived, and where Harriet Tubman, had gone back to, and so they are sort of working on unearthing that right now. So the work goes on, and doubtless there will be other discoveries in the years ahead. A couple of years ago, a photograph of Harriet Tubman taken in Auburn was found, wearing a lovely dress, looking very beautiful. It had been in someone's scrapbook, and no one had ever seen it before. So these are, it's so exciting whenever something like that comes to the surface. Martha Coffin Wright and Frances Seward were I kind of, there had been one book about a scholarly book about Martha Wright many years ago, about a decade ago. Frances Seward was always just, except for Doris Kearns Goodwin and Team of Rivals, who did acknowledge that Frances was more radical than her very famous husband and deserved more recognition, really had been overlooked. And so, but what we're discovering by the way scholars are looking at American history now, some of these untold stories are finally, coming to light.
I wonder if people in the South and the new resistance against radical race theory will get to learn about Harriet Tubman, or would that part of history will be whitewashed?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I have to say that I learned a lot about it was called the Kumbi River Raid, where Tubman took part in this raid that liberated 750 enslaved people. I heard about that from a man who had written a slim book about it. He was self-taught, not a scholar, and I read his book, and then I called him up, and when I was going down to South Carolina, and I said, I want to understand this territory better, where this raid took place, what was, Tubman lived in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is part of Port Royal. And so he gave me, his name is Jeff Grigg, and he gave me a tour. We spent all day together, and he himself has been trying to keep this memory alive, and he discovered that some of what had been written about Harriet Tubman in South Carolina was inaccurate. So he's been trying to correct the record a little bit. A lot of people sort of sloppily say, well, she led this raid up the Combahee River. She didn't lead it. She was under the leadership of a white abolitionist colonel, but she played a very central role. So it isn't impugning her in any way to sort of set the record straight. So my book came out during the pandemic, and so I wasn't able to go out and talk about it. I did everything by Zoom, but I'm hoping when the paperback is issued in March that I'll be able to go down south and talk about it. And I'm sure I will get some pushback, definitely. But it's important that these stories get out and that a conversation happens between, people who are dubious still about Northerners and who want to protect what they think about the Confederacy.
Right. I wonder, and this is my last question, I wonder what kind of parallels we can draw from that time history, women's rights and anti-slavery movement with today, let's say, women's rights still and the Black Lives Matters or any kind of equal rights for Black Americans.
It took me a long time to write this book. It took 7 years, but
Wow.
as I was working, because I have this full-time job, and also there was a lot of research involved, but as I was working on it, I kept being struck by the parallels. So in 1840, Martha Coffin Wright was telling her husband that women deserve to be paid for as much as well as so the woman who did her sewing, helped her with her sewing, deserved to be paid as much as the woman who helped her husband with his outdoor chores. Her husband thought that was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. But that was, hundreds of years before Congress addressed this issue and said, yes, women deserve equal pay for work of, comparable work. And women, especially Black women, are still not being paid the same. And then one of the first things that struck me about Frances Seward was that in her letters was that early on in the late 1820s and early 1830s, her sister, who lived around the corner, was being badly beaten by her husband. And there was no recourse at the time. Men were literally allowed by the law to do whatever they wanted to their wives, including beat them. So that was just a revelation to me. And then, of course, the Me Too movement erupted. And the continuities are so clear, and they continue to this day. So I kept thinking, well, yes, there's white supremacy. We kept seeing these eruptions during the Trump era and the encouragement of violent acts by white supremacists. But I kept thinking, well, it's not really as bad as it was in the 1850s until the assault on the United States Capitol, when men and women broke into the Capitol and were waving Confederate flags. So this is one of the reasons we have to understand our history and continue to push back against these tides, and that is happening. There are grassroots movements today, as we know, led by Stacey Abrams and others on behalf of voting rights for African Americans who are still, across the country, there are efforts to suppress the vote. So democracy is this ongoing project, and you just have to keep being an active citizen.
Well, as much as we think the United States are leaders in so many civil liberties, there's still a lot of progress to be made.
I know, sadly, there is. But this would not have surprised any of these women.
Yeah. Dorothy, well, the last question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow you?
Yes, so it is, I think I have a copy here somewhere. Hold on. It's called The Agitators, 3 Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. And on my website, dorothywickenden.com, it gives instructions about clicking to buy it wherever you like. And I also have a slideshow on there, which I love, which shows the women and all the other main characters in the book. And so it gives you a real, and some of the letters, they're facsimiles of some of the letters they wrote. So
yeah, the last sentence just got cut off. But Dorothy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.